By day 60 of a war, alarm bells are usually supposed to ring in America. Not on the front line, not at air bases, and not aboard aircraft carriers, but in Congress. Under America's War Powers Resolution, a president who continues military operations for more than 60 days is supposed to obtain congressional authorization. That is the theory. In practice, Donald Trump has not asked Congress for permission to continue the war with Iran. The president argues that the ceasefire with Tehran, which entered into force on April 8th, suspended the 60-day clock. The war with Iran has therefore entered a strange new phase. On the one hand, the hot phase of the conflict appears to be over. American and Israeli aircraft have halted strikes on targets inside Iran. Iran, in turn, has stopped its retaliatory attacks on Israel and the Arab states on the Persian Gulf. But the central problem remains unresolved. The Strait of Hormuz is still being blocked, and by both sides of the conflict. Iran is stopping foreign vessels that attempt to pass through Hormuz without paying a special transit fee to Tehran. The Americans, meanwhile, are enforcing a maritime blockade of their own, targeting all vessels traveling to and from Iran. In the background, negotiations are still underway. Through Pakistani mediators, the United States and Iran continue to exchange various proposals for ending the conflict. So far, however, none of them has been strong enough to satisfy both sides. And although the end of the war with Iran still appears distant, one thing is already clear. The conflict is producing lasting shifts in the regional balance of power. The clearest example is the decision by the United Arab Emirates to leave the OPEC cartel. Let's break it all down. Brent crude at $108 a barrel, the S&P hitting all-time highs, the UAE walking out of OPEC. These aren't abstract headlines, they are the direct result of the war. Markets move with every development in the Strait of Hormuz, every back-channel negotiation, every decision coming out of Abu Dhabi or Washington. And I have been trying to stay ahead of these shifts for years rather than just watching them happen. That is why I use XTB Investment app, the partner of this channel and place where I manage my own investments. The platform gives you access to over 8,800 stocks and ETFs from across the globe, including companies in the energy, industrial, and tech sectors. And as long as my monthly turnover doesn't exceed the equivalent of 100,000 euros, I buy stocks and ETFs on XTB commission-free, then 0.2% commission applies. Just keep in mind that all investing involves risk. Since April 8th, when the ceasefire entered into force, the United States and Iran have been exchanging proposals to end the conflict. The plan currently on the table was presented by Tehran last week. According to press reports, the Iranian proposal is divided into 3 phases. The first phase, lasting 30 days, would establish a permanent ceasefire backed by mutual guarantees of non-aggression, not only between the United States and Iran, but also involving Israel. Iran would gradually lift its blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. In return, the United States would gradually ease its own maritime blockade of Iran. The question of Iran's nuclear program would only be addressed in the second phase. Tehran still refuses to shut down its nuclear facilities. At the same time, however, Iran is prepared to make significant concessions. A full 15-year freeze on uranium enrichment, followed by enrichment only up to 3.6%, as well as a commitment not to accumulate enriched uranium on Iranian territory. If a compromise on the nuclear program were reached, the parties would move to the third phase. At that point, the United States would gradually lift sanctions on Iran and allow the release of Iranian assets worth more than $100 billion. Assets that have been frozen in various countries since 2018. According to Axios, in a newest report from May 6, The United States and Iran are actively negotiating a 14-point agreement, and Washington expects Tehran's response within 48 hours. Although the Iranian proposal is better than anything Tehran has offered before, it is doubtful that President Trump will accept it. Doing so would deprive him of the strongest card he currently holds, the maritime blockade of Iran. Trump believes that blocking Iran's ports can achieve more than continued bombing. A naval blockade means Iran can no longer freely export oil as it did at the beginning of the war, and oil remains the main source of funding for the Islamic Republic. Trump claims that because of the blockade, Iran is losing roughly $500 million a day, and that in the end this pressure will force Tehran to make concessions and accept an agreement on American terms. This line of thinking is not without logic. Once Iran's oil storage facilities are full, Tehran will have to shut down production at individual oil fields, generating enormous financial losses. The problem is that no one knows exactly when Iran will run out of storage capacity. On April 27th, analysts at Kepler estimated that Iran would run out of space to store oil within 12 to 22 days. But that is only an estimate. Lower production combined with even a partial ability to circumvent the American blockade would slow the pace at which storage fills up. And as Kepler itself notes, the moment Iran's storage tanks are full does not automatically mean Iran is cut off from oil revenues. Iran currently has around 184 million barrels of oil at sea, including 124 million near Singapore and China. Those barrels will gradually make their way into Chinese ports. As a result, Tehran may not feel the full financial impact of the American blockade for another 3 to 4 months, meaning around late July or early August. Of course, that assumes the American maritime blockade is fully airtight and that no Iranian tankers are able to slip through. And that is far from guaranteed. Iran has extensive experience evading American sanctions, as well as a large shadow fleet it has used for years to smuggle oil to China. And while Kepler says that so far no Iranian tanker has broken through the American blockade, other analytical firms are less certain. In recent days, for example, the supertanker Huge appeared off the coast of Indonesia carrying 1.9 million barrels of oil. It had departed Iran shortly after the blockade was announced. Individual breakthroughs like this do not amount to a systemic solution, but every Iranian tanker that manages to outmaneuver the US Navy pushes back the critical moment for Iran's oil storage capacity and for Iranian state finances. Tehran is trying to downplay the impact of the American blockade on its domestic economy, arguing that it has alternative ways to export oil to China, including rail links. But physically, rail cannot replace maritime transport at this scale. At the same time, Iran claims that time is on its side. It points to the cost that high oil and gas prices caused by the prolonged blockade of Hormuz are imposing on the global economy. Plus, Beijing has also come to Tehran's aid. China's Ministry of Commerce has ordered domestic companies to ignore American sanctions against 5 Chinese refineries linked to the trade in Iranian oil, invoking a special 2021 blocking statute. This is the first case of its kind in history. Tehran now hopes that this decision will be followed by further moves from Beijing designed to help break the American blockade. The current ceasefire is full of paradoxes. Not only are Iran's blockade of Hormuz and America's blockade of Iranian ports still in place, but the United States is also continuing to reinforce its military presence in the region. In late April, the carrier strike group led by the USS George H.W. Bush arrived in the Middle East. As a result, for the first time since 2003, the Americans had as many as 3 carrier strike groups deployed in this theater. Had because in early May it emerged that the technical condition of the USS Gerald R. Ford made it impossible for the carrier to remain in the region any longer, and it began its return journey to the United States. Additional ground and air forces are also being deployed to the region, and President Trump himself has not ruled out resuming strikes on Iran if the peace talks fail. According to Axios, in late April, Admiral Brad Cooper, the head of CENTCOM, presented the president with a list of options in the event that the war with Iran is resumed. Such a move in practice amounts to a violation of the War Powers Resolution discussed earlier. But the Trump administration sees it differently. It argues that the law itself is unconstitutional, and that there are plenty of historical precedents for presidents ignoring it. In 2011, for example, the Obama administration intervened in Libya without congressional authorization. And once the 60-day deadline passed, it simply argued that these were not hostilities but a NATO support operation. The war with Iran is unpopular, both among American voters and on Capitol Hill. But even in Congress and even among Democrats, there is no consensus on whether the president should be forced to end military operations. Because even lawmakers who opposed the initial strike on Iran acknowledge that the current situation is unacceptable for the United States. Tehran has effectively taken the Strait of Hormuz, and with it, a large part of the global economy hostage. For America, that is intolerable both economically and in terms of prestige. In the shadows of the war with Iran, fighting continues in Lebanon. Although a ceasefire has officially been in place since April 16th, one Tehran strongly pushed for, clashes between Israel and Hezbollah continue at lower intensity. Satellite imagery and video footage show Israel systematically demolishing villages and towns in southern Lebanon. The IDF says these operations are aimed at Hezbollah, but analysts argue that real objective is to create a buffer zone, a strip of no man's land similar to the strategy Israel pursued in Gaza after 2023. The situation is especially severe in three Christian villages, Ain Ebel, Remeish and Debel, located inside the Israeli-controlled security zone. They are cut off from the rest of Lebanon and surrounded by Israeli military posts, making humanitarian access difficult. Still, local Christians refuse to leave. They fear that if they do, their homes will be blown up by the IDF and they will never be allowed to return. It was in Debel that photos showed an Israeli soldier smashing a statue of Jesus with a hammer, triggering outrage in Western media. Another flashpoint is the Persian Gulf, where Iran continues to lay naval mines. The scale of the operation is unclear, but before the war, Iran had roughly 5,000 to 6,000 naval mines, and analysts say the current campaign appears chaotic and rushed. That will make the demining much harder once a peace deal is reached. Clearing the strait could take from 1 to 4 months. Washington wants Europe to help, since European navies have more mine countermeasure vessels and more experience in this field. But given Trump's tensions with Europe and his decision to withdraw 5,000 US troops from Germany, the chances of meaningful European assistance look limited. A way out of the current crisis still looks distant, while the economic costs of the war with Iran continue to rise. Brent futures are trading at around $108 a barrel, with WTI near $102. But spot prices, the price of a physical barrel of oil, are much higher. The premium between oil futures and physical barrels is now more than $25 a barrel. As a result, the average price of gasoline in the United States has jumped by 42%, the fastest fuel price increase in the G7. By comparison, prices rose 24% in Canada, 19% in Britain, and just 4.6% in Italy. The reason is simple. Americans pay far lower fuel taxes than Europeans, while European governments introduced subsidies to cushion the shock. In the US, the cost of more expensive fuel was passed directly onto consumers. But while American consumers are losing, America's energy sector is making extraordinary profits. US crude exports have reached a record 6 million barrels a day. Importers in Europe and Asia, cut off from supplies from the Persian Gulf, are now buying American oil instead. Roughly 80 empty supertankers are currently heading to the United States to load crude, almost 3 times more than before the war. The United States is also gaining ground in refined fuels. In April, 1/3 of the European Union's jet fuel came from American refineries, twice the previous level. Rystad Energy estimates that if Brent stays near $100, cash flows at US oil companies could rise by $63 billion this year. Over the longer term, LNG exports may deliver an even bigger windfall. Asia, which before the war sourced more than 25% of its LNG from the Gulf, is urgently looking for alternatives, and the United States is now the only credible supplier at scale. Yet despite these enormous gains, America's energy giants, Exxon, Chevron and ConocoPhillips, are signaling that they do not intend to raise production beyond pre-war plans. The number of active rigs in the Permian Basin, America's largest oil field, has barely changed since the start of the war. Big Oil fears a repeat of the boom-bust cycle from a decade ago, when the price collapse after 2014 forced the industry into massive write-downs. Today, the majors prefer dividends and share buybacks. Because even as Big Oil makes huge profits from the war, it appears reluctant to believe that the crisis will produce a lasting structural shift in its favor. And there is logic in that. Over the longer term, this crisis will almost certainly accelerate the global energy transition, driven not by oil, but by renewables and uranium. Asia is feeling the energy shock far more painfully. Refineries across the region rely on imported crude for roughly 80% of their supply, and before the war, about half of that came from the Persian Gulf. The consequences have been severe. Japan and South Korea have tapped strategic reserves. India is rationing fuel for some sectors, and in countries such as Myanmar, Malaysia and Pakistan, pump prices have risen by more than 50%, with physical shortages emerging. Europe is adjusting faster. It has larger regulatory buffers and can rely on government subsidies, which is why fuel prices there are rising more slowly than in the United States. Even so, demand destruction is now visible on the continent, especially in jet fuel, which has become scarce. Lufthansa, for example, has cancelled 20,000 flights to save 40,000 tons of fuel. And although the end of the war with Iran is still nowhere in sight, the situation in Asian fuel markets should improve soon. From early May, China is resuming fuel exports, mainly jet fuel, but also diesel and gasoline. Where? To Southeast Asian markets such as Vietnam, the Philippines and Bangladesh, as well as to Australia. This brings us to another paradox of the war. Oil prices are surging, inflation is rising, the Fed is holding off on rate cuts, and yet on May 1st, the S&P 500 closed at another all-time high, 7,230 points. How is that possible? After all, previous energy crises, like those of the 1973 and 1979, ended in sharp stock market sell-offs. The main difference is that the United States is now a structurally different economy than it was in the 1970s. In 1973, America imported roughly 35% of its oil. Today it is the world's largest net exporter of petroleum products. Domestic production has risen from around 5 million barrels per day in 2005 to 13.6 million in 2025, setting new historical records. The price shock is hurting American consumers, but at the same time, it represents a massive redistribution of capital toward America's energy companies. And although a final agreement between the United States and Iran still looks distant, the war is already reshaping the balance of power in the Middle East. On May 1st, the United Arab Emirates left OPEC. Officially, the reason is financial. In recent years, the UAE has invested heavily to raise its production capacity to 5 million barrels per day by 2027. OPEC quotas, however, capped Emirati output at roughly 3.4 million. Abu Dhabi now says it wants to use its full capacity and expand exports. But why the rush? Why leave OPEC on May 1st while the Strait of Hormuz is still blocked and the UAE's ability to export around Hormuz remains severely limited? Because geopolitics matter more than money. For years, the UAE has been locked in rivalry with Saudi Arabia. The two states have clashed through proxies in Yemen and Sudan, while the personal competition between Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed has also grown sharper. We covered the Saudi Emirati rivalry in a previous episode. But while tensions between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi existed before, the war with Iran appears to have pushed them over the edge. The UAE, not Israel, became the main target of Iranian attacks. More Iranian ballistic missiles and drones hit the Emirates than Israel. That drove Abu Dhabi into an extremely hawkish position. It lobbied other members of the Gulf Cooperation Council to support retaliatory strikes against Iran. To the UAE's frustration, Saudi Arabia refused to back that aggressive line. The result was a deeper split between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, and even closer alignment between the Emirates and Israel, with which the UAE formally established relations during Donald Trump's first term. According to recent reporting in the American press, that cooperation has become extremely close. During the current war, Israel reportedly sent an Iron Dome system and Israeli specialists to the UAE to help defend it against Iranian fire. The UAE's decision to leave OPEC reflects a deeper crisis now unfolding among the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. On the horizon, we can already see a sharper Saudi-Emirati rivalry and a deeper cooperation between the UAE and Israel. The move also seriously undermines OPEC's role in controlling the oil market. Once the war ends, the UAE could add more than 1 million barrels a day to global supply, with major consequences for oil prices and for OPEC itself. There is no speculation that other cartel members may follow the Emirati path. More problems may also be coming. The UAE is reportedly considering freezing its membership in both the Arab League and the Gulf Cooperation Council. The second dimension of regional change is the intensifying rivalry between Turkey and Israel. Even before the war with Iran began, former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, now planning a political comeback, equated the Iranian threat with the Turkish one. Israeli media, meanwhile, been describing Turkey as the next Iran. Turkish-Israeli rivalry has existed for years, but the events of recent weeks have given it new force. Ankara is watching Israel's increasingly expansive regional policy with growing suspicion, especially because the Kurds have become one of its instruments. With American support, Israel tried to use Kurdish forces against the Islamic Republic. Turkey is especially sensitive to the Kurdish question. In the coming years, Ankara will almost certainly strengthen its support for Syria, seeing it as a natural buffer zone against the spread of Israeli influence in the region. So where is this all heading? The honest answer is that no one really knows, not Trump and not the Iranians. The current trajectory of the war is the product of many separate decisions, often made emotionally and without a broader strategy. That was true of the opening salvo, when the United States and Israel eliminated Ayatollah Khamenei, hoping it would collapse the structures of the Islamic Republic. That plan failed. And there is no guarantee that current American strategy will work either, forcing Tehran into concessions through a blockade of Iranian ports. Especially because gunboat diplomacy is not being practiced by Washington alone. The United States is blocking Iranian ports, but Iran is blocking the Strait of Hormuz. The American blockade is imposing serious costs on Iran's economy. The Iranian blockade is imposing serious costs on the global economy. America in 2026 may be an energy hegemon, but even it is not fully immune to the economic fallout of a prolonged Hormuz blockade, especially if that blockade triggers recession in Asia and Europe. Maybe that is why President Trump has introduced another concept, Project Freedom. Starting Monday, May 4th, the US Navy is supposed to help ships trapped in the Persian Gulf safely cross the Strait of Hormuz and return to their home ports. But only hours after the initiative was announced, it became clear that this does not mean US Navy escorts for commercial vessels, something Trump has promised from the beginning of the war. Instead, Project Freedom merely means that the United States will inform ships about the safest routes through Hormuz. In response, the Iranians shelled several ships attempting to cross the strait and carried out an attack on Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates, although Israel and the UAE reportedly lobbied Washington for Trump to resume strikes on Iran in retaliation. The president stated that Iran's actions did not constitute a violation of the ceasefire terms. At the same time, on May 5th, Trump announced the suspension of Project Freedom, just one day after it had begun. Like several other Trump initiatives, Project Freedom appears aimed less at actually solving the Hormuz crisis than at reassuring markets that a solution is close, even if it is not. Since the first strikes on Iran, Trump has had two goals: to break the Islamic Republic and to convince the markets that the war will be short, with no long-term impact on the global economy. Does Trump believe that? Probably not, but the narrative buys him time. The Iranians are playing the same game. Their own message is built around the threat of an approaching global economic crisis and recession. Each side believes time is working in its favor. This leads to both sides digging into the positions they have already taken and to a negotiating stalemate. A breakthrough would require significant concessions from one of the parties. Although at first glance neither Trump nor Tehran appears ready to make such concessions, the suspension of Project Freedom may suggest that the president is at least considering a partial deal with Iran. For now, however, this is only speculation. As a result, from Beirut in Lebanon to Chabahar in Iran, a strange state of play continues. Neither war nor peace.